Gentlemen, welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Institute, and we're counter-programming the debate tonight with substance, and we're counter-programming the election with reminding the U.S. there's something beyond the border, and we're hoping that both of those bits of counter-programming have a salutary effect on what's to come after. In that spirit, we could not ask for a better speaker today than Arminio Fraga, and of course his infinitely long, detailed biography I left upstairs. Let me just come back to him and Bob in a moment while my brain does its Google search. We're very delighted to have Arminio Fraga and Robert Zoellick here to speak this morning on the outlook for Brazil, and then thinking about how the U.S. has to start worrying about these things, Brazil and its neighbors. Let me just say a brief word that the Institute has a long history, of course, working on Brazil and Latin American issues, starting, of course, with John Williamson long ago. And we have continued to rebuild that effort now with Monica de Bola here, covering Brazil, with Jose de Gregorio as a non-resident fellow, and to have the benefit of friends like Arminio, like Robert, like Mac McClarty and others here who help us find our way through this. Just to emphasize, what has been striking to me is if you say, what haven't the presidential candidates spoken about, at least in the international economic sphere, that's important, one, of course, can come up with a list, and it's a list that gets buried in the many other lists of things the candidates have not spoken about. But we saw a potential real turning point in Latin America beginning to become evident. You think of the overture in Cuba and the change coming there. You look at the instability, unfortunately so sad, in Venezuela. You look at the change of government, first in Argentina, then in Brazil. There is a potential, I would like to think, if we can take a slightly longer view, for a virtuous cycle reinforcing among the neighbors. But of course, with the difficulties, particularly Venezuela, but also Brazil face, there is the potential for a downward cycle as we're seeing the spillovers from Venezuela into Colombia, the backlash, the frustration in Brazil, somewhat dragging down the best efforts in Argentina, and so on. And so this is up to the people and the leadership of Latin American economies, but there has to be a role for the U.S. to do something positive. And it's in that spirit we're starting this set of programming. We'll continue next week with Federico Sturzenegger from the Central Bank of Argentina, ahead of the IMF meetings, as well as Mr. Garcia from the Central Bank of the Republic of Chile, and presentations by our own Jose de Gregorio, Monica de Bola, and Chad Bown. Let me now briefly introduce Arminio Fraga, who needs no introduction. As they say, there are not an infinite number of people who need no introduction. He's one of a few dozen. Arminio, of course, a distinguished career, MIT PhD, I believe. What? Princeton? Oh dear, I was trying to upgrade you and you didn't let me. Princeton PhD, distinguished service as the governor of the Central Bank of Brazil in a previous effort. Then leadership in the private sector as the founder of Gávea Investments, a leading long-term investor in Brazil. He continues to be a member of the Group of 30 and a leader in the discussion around central banking as well as in Latin America. And we're delighted to have him with us today. After his remarks, former USTR ambassador, former World Bank president, delighted to say current member of the Institute's board and executive committee, Robert Zoellick, will speak. Robert, as you all know, is uniquely able and principled about combining his commitment to freer trade and economics, sound economics, with the diplomatic vision. And that is why we hope to have Robert follow on Arminio and help us understand whether the U.S. should be paying attention and what it might do. Without any more, please let me turn to Arminio. Thank you so much for joining us at the Institute.
Morning, Thank you, Adam, for having me here. Great to share the discussion space here with Bob. That will certainly not only help me with my own country, but also with this connection with the U.S. that is so important for us in Brazil. We're going through quite a lot, and I'm going to try to summarize my views. But just to get you going, we are at hopefully at the end of a gigantic recession. So it's a drop of 7 points in GDP over a 2.5-year period. So it's a 10% drop in GDP per capita, roughly, maybe a tad less. It happened very fast. Is something that doesn't happen in the sort of standard business cycle. And there is a second track to this that's equally amazing, if not more, that comes from the political side of things, where we've had a president just impeached. And in parallel to that, we're going through the largest, most amazing corruption scandals, plural, that are connected. And I will try to convince you briefly that these things are all part of something that is, well, anyway, there are common roots to all of this. So let me start with the economic track where I'm more comfortable speaking. Adam, I'm not sure what sort of the rules or press or any of that stuff here, but anyway, I tend to be careful, but I won't hold anything back, which I usually don't anyway. So here's the story, and I won't go back too far, but it might help. President Cardoso got rid of hyperinflation. This was like mid-90s. And I believe kind of found a good path to kind of say to develop Brazil. It was fairly standard and fairly simple, but it seemed to be working. It entailed a substantial reform of the state that was to be directed to kind of the more basic and more important things like education, health, proper regulatory environment, respect for the rule of law, this kind of thing. Next to sort of reasonable kind of macroeconomic policies to avoid the classic cycle we see all over Latin America over decades of booms and busts and crises and so on. We had the good fortune of seeing President Cardoso be followed by President Lula, and it was quite surprising, I must say, at the time, because most people in Brazil thought that someday he or someone with his background would win, and that would be a real problem. Not politically necessarily, probably not, but certainly from an economic standpoint. And to his eternal credit, he came in and pretty much threw away his party program and did quite well in his first term. And also, in a way, got lucky too. The commodities boom, so the really spectacular commodities boom, kind of China connected, started right as he came in. I'm sure he thinks he created that too. So he rode that quite well. Trouble looking back is he took care of the demand side pretty well. Was also the beginning of a credit boom. The supply side never kicked in a meaningful way. So investment didn't do much, and even the stuff that would generate productivity gains was modest. It was there for about 3 years and then slipped. And the slippage actually happened with the departure of his former finance minister, Mr. Palocci, who, by the way, was just arrested this morning, in case you hadn't heard. who, despite other aspects of his life, turned out to be a fine finance minister, but the whole package evidently had a lot of problems. Once that started to happen, we saw Brazil deviate back on the economic front to a model that we had tried in the well-known 30 years of growth from the 1950 to 1980. But that really didn't take us all the way. And if you recall, in 1950, or maybe you don't, some of you may not know, in 1950, Brazil's GDP per capita was about 12% of the U.S.'s. And at the end of this period, it was double that. It was about a quarter of the U.S., give or take. So it was a good run. The trouble was it was the wrong model. So it was a closed economy, no focus on education, on productivity, no focus on equality of opportunity, the distribution of income, poverty, none of that. And it basically blew up and led us into hyperinflation and whatnot. Strangely enough, halfway into the Lula years, we saw it became clear that this was beginning to happen in Brazil. And we saw it, in fact, early on with this former President Dilma Rousseff was in charge of the energy sector, and we saw it very clearly in power and in oil, where she basically ruined whatever attempt at a proper framework for these sectors to grow and to be, to deliver what they ought to deliver, and started intervening very heavily and led to massive problems in both cases, and not just economic. The government also made other movements or moves in other areas, such as credit, and it was the beginning of a massive presence of the government in lending. The share of government banks in the economy rose from around 40% to almost 2/3. So 2/3 or 60-some% of the assets in our banking system are now in the books of government banks that, as you can imagine, with all the stuff that's going on in the political world, we're not making wise sort of capital allocation or credit allocation decisions during these years. In parallel to all this, we saw the first glimpses of the kind of political monster that is now completely visible in a scandal. Was the first big one, called in Portuguese we call it the Big Monthly. There was an operation to generate cash to pay a very large number of people in Congress through kickbacks and the like. This was uncovered, and a lot of people were tried, and at that point, President Lula started to lose. He's lost an enormous number of people. They've been tried and convicted, including his chief of staff, who was like his prime minister, his number two. Mac McLarty is here. He knows how this works better than anyone. He was very important, needless to say. Mr. José Dirceu and many others. I think 3 or 4 of the party treasurers are jailed, and so on. So that was one. As soon as, anyway, that was there, it kind of was put to rest. It seemed like a good moment for Brazil. But the politics still felt kind of complicated. And in order to understand that, there's some things that you must keep in mind. We have in Brazil over 30 parties. So it makes working based on principles and long-term ideas for the country nearly impossible. So the system became like a bazaar of small coalitions based on small ideas and money. So it's very complicated. Besides this system that had been sort of wasn't put in place totally by Lula. I don't want to be unfair, but he really took it to a new level. There were also some other strange things happening. It's worth mentioning. Most people don't know, but the Lula government twice tried to pass through Congress laws that would have given them significant control over the press and media in general, but the press in particular. And I happen to think that things for a free press, including kind of 21st century press, internet and so on, a lot of these things we're seeing now, people being exposed, tried, judged favorably, unfavorably, probably wouldn't have happened. I think everything is happening in sort of very broad daylight and really puts a lot of pressure on all the institutions that are doing their job. So the public prosecutors, the judiciary, the federal police, they're doing well, and they're completely exposed, which is a wonderful thing. So this is a plus. So during Lula's second term, to continue with my little story, he maintained macro discipline, became a little weaker on the budgetary side. You saw the appearance of accounting tricks of all sorts, but it's hard to say that they lost control. The trouble is then, Lula ended up managing to elect his successor, now former President Dilma Rousseff, and from then on things started to get more complicated. She, at first, kept on slipping, but gradually, but came in triple strong on the, call it the interventionist, heavy-handed side. So that was point number one. At the time, they were with great fanfare, they called their model the new economic matrix. It was as if they thought they had invented something new. And it basically entailed the following. They had huge amounts of credit provided by the government, a good chunk of that subsidized, particularly the BNDES part, but also from the kind of government saving and loan. Tax breaks that were provided with, trust me, no economic logic whatsoever, and quite frankly, no social logic either. So it was no logic, I guess, just private and party interests, basically. There was growing protection against foreign competition. Brazil is not a very open economy, but it didn't move in any way in any good direction. And then cozy contracts with the government. So just to list them, cheap credit, subsidized protection, tax breaks, cozy contracts. And they call this the new economic matrix. And they thought this was, be a revolutionary thing, which is well, it is what it is. And of course, it didn't work. And instead of trying to deal with it in a reasonably rational way, even within the kind of framework that they have, it seemed to me at the time that every moment of trouble, every problem that arose was met with a bad response. So the reaction function of particularly the Dilma government was really tragic. And while all that was happening, much to the surprise of most people, another gigantic scandal appeared, this one at Petrobras, which, by the way, Dilma Rousseff had been chairperson of the board for a good number of years during the Lula administration. This one was bigger and more and amazing, and it happened in a company that is probably not really a true company in the way we think of, Ford Motor Company that's here is here today, or Google, but it was a very structured, disciplined organization that had non-economic objectives, but was well organized and so on. Very proud of being quite meritocratic, even the people had their careers and so on. And all of a sudden, Petrobras, they take it over. Some spots where the money was, as a sort of the old story here in the States, with they asked someone why you rob banks, right? So it's where the money is. So Petrobras is a lot of money, and we now know also that was another one of these operations. So it's pretty amazing. The paint had barely dried from the first scandal, and now we bumped into this one. My conclusion, by the way, was if this happened at Petrobras, it has to be everywhere. And that's still what I think, everywhere, in different degrees. So it's a sign, it's a symptom of a deeper disease that has to do with their cultural elements, has to do with this notion of what the state is supposed to do. A lot of it comes from our Portuguese roots, with all due respect to anyone from Portugal present, but Portugal has its own problems too. And I think that's kind of the underlying fight that we're going to have to continue to work on for, I think, decades. So then, now moving towards my conclusion, a little bit of the present. Into this comes the former, come two things. One is talk of impeachment. And impeachment in Brazil, according to our constitution, requires the existence of some kind of felony, a crime. And if a president is to be found guilty of a crime, he or she can then be taken to an impeachment trial, and most people in the world of politics in Brazil then think the crime is kind of the entry door to a broader discussion, and that's exactly what happened. A lot of detail that I won't bore you with that might have weakened the case a little bit, but I really believe there were plenty of crimes, and the thing was done well. Many of my younger friends, including my children and all those, are saying, well, this is also very bad because she's being impeached by a bunch of politicians who themselves are also being investigated and so on. They're all, so there's this general feeling in Brazil about the system as a whole that leads to these notions that this might have been a coup or something like that. It wasn't, but it is true that the system is kind of the way I'm describing here. It's pretty bad. But there's a sidetrack on this that was I think to us there on the ground also pretty amazing, and that was what then Vice President Temer did. And here you have to remember, he was, for years, president of the largest party in Brazil, is the PMDB, which, by the way, has 13% of the votes in the House, so it's a highly fragmented political system. He was president of the PMDB, that has been the party in government forever type of operation, and to most people's surprise, so he's like the co-controlling shareholder of this enterprise. Okay, so it's PT, PMDB, and they had satellite partners, many, probably 20 plus as well. But they were in charge, and he then kind of blew the whistle to most people's surprise, including mine, and went public saying, look, this can't continue. This is a disaster. I am the vice president. I just want to let you know that I understand what's going on, and here are my proposals. And he put on paper some proposals that were unbelievable. They were really in this sort of populist environment of ours. I think it's very bold. Talking about Social Security reform. Now there's on the table a proposal to cap the growth in government expenditures and more. It was a collection of things that many of us on the ground have been proposing for quite some time, and particularly after the 2014 elections, which were also another kind of winning moment for populism, with kind of consequences for the quality of the debate, as you would expect. So anyway, so she takes over, and we see the reaction function is explosive. The problem comes, she creates two more. The need for a little more macro discipline becomes obvious. She doubles up the bet in the wrong direction, and so on. So this is a world that's totally different than actually what we're seeing in most parts of the world at this point. amazingly, as we approached the end of her first term and elections, she, in particular, blew a massive hole in the budget. And this happened over 2-3 years, but there was a deterioration of about 6 points of GDP, which is big, considering we have a debt-to-GDP ratio sort of close to 70%, very high interest rates, 6% in real terms, and, well, low growth for a while now. Sort of we're hopefully at the end of a depression. So the government's credit or the debt dynamics became a major issue, and you don't need to be from MIT to understand that if you have 70% debt to GDP ratio, 6% primary, 6% real rates, and no growth, it's going to grow fast. I mean, really fast. And the trouble with this, by the way, is that even if you take a longer view, the growth engine is broke. We have very low investment rates in Brazil, and as we stood at the time of President Dilma's impeachment, no hope that the investment was going to jump in. It just didn't have to think very hard about that. So the macro side, that's kind of where we are. They had also been fighting inflation with the classic tools of freezing some prices and fudging things. Not quite as bad as we saw with our neighbors in the South. They were just using the eraser, erase the number, write another one, but pretty bad. So here we are. The impeachment happened, and in comes President Temer, trying to do something about this with his background, with the political system we have, and so on. Very complicated. So here's how I see the news recently. I think is mostly good against this pretty hard-to-manage backdrop. So just to say it one last time, because it's very bad, I don't want you to forget it, because I'm going to say some more positive things in a minute. 70% debt to GDP ratio exploding, a growth engine that is broke. Kind of the microeconomy of Brazil is a disaster. That's bad news, but it means there's a lot to do also. And a political system that is fragmented and mostly thinking about how to stay out of jail for the most part. This is just starting, by the way. I think another side story here, the private sector business people that were tried and many have been convicted are already behind bars, and this is probably 80 or 90% done. On the political side, it goes to the Supreme Court, and we're probably going to have, I would bet, over 100 people being tried, politicians being tried. They have this privilege of just being judged by the Supreme Court, which will, by the way, will have to beef up its staff to handle this. Will be quite a big project. And this hasn't happened yet. So that's kind of where we are. President Temer has a little over 2 years to go. He tabled these proposals. And so just looking at it, here's the sequence, the way I see it. Impeachment. I think from an economic standpoint, for sure, fantastic. It's never good for any country to go through this, but I think it's eminently fair, and her departure crucial. I think we would have blown up. And I think because she had this tendency of taking everything as a personal injury, as a personal offense, I was really terrified. She seems to be the kind of person that takes a red light in traffic as a personal offense. So and that was very scary. So she's gone. Good news. President Temer, a year ago, made these proposals that sounded kind of crazy at the time. I had about a month earlier put my ideas on paper, published them in the newspapers. Those are the things that I couldn't say during the campaign of 2014, where I was involved with the PSDB candidate. I said quite a bit, but in code, just for Monica and a half a dozen others. But I said it in a more colorful way at that time. But me saying it didn't matter, President Temer saying matters. So he comes in with this behind him. Then he picks an excellent team, his very strong people at the central bank, finance ministry, the foreign affairs ministry, the BNDES, Petrobras, education, there's a ministry of cities, urban matters, a young ministry, quite good, and then a whole bunch of others that I still don't know even who they are, but there's a core there that is quite strong. I think all of that is very good news. So the question now that stands before us is, will they be able to execute? Will they be able to get these reforms done, and will they be approved in a way that helps stop the debt dynamics and so on? That remains to be seen. I'm cautiously optimistic they get this ceiling on government expenditures done. It's a very good idea. It's very radical. It doesn't impose too many constraints in the near term, which I think is an issue. I would rather have seen some of the effort done now. I don't quite like proposals that say, here are changes that will make future governments go through significant austerity. It's probably better to lead by example, like in most things in life. But besides that, I think that's good. They're also proposing some Social Security changes that are crucial. Without the Social Security reform, the ceiling on the growth in government expenditures doesn't work, because about half of the expenditures come from our very extravagant Social Security system. So we need that as well. That part is being negotiated more at the retail level, which is always very dangerous, because you lose sense of kind of what your final objective is. And so anyway, that's where we are. We have local elections coming up soon, and I think after that we're going to see. I'm pretty confident they're going to vote the ceiling, and Social Security will be a coming attraction for next year. Parallel to this, the noises from the kind of the bottom-up side, the micro side, are good. A natural frontier of investment in Brazil would be, at this point, infrastructure. The gaps in our infrastructure are monumental, and so I think you could attract a lot of capital. Just needed, a lot more regulatory or overall certainty to kick in. Manufacturing is more complicated. There's a lot of excess capacity. It's very hard to convince anyone to invest when you have that much excess capacity. Consumers are somewhat burdened also, because interest rates are very, very high. So not easy. Most people are skeptical of a strong bounce, because you would expect to see it with the kind of recession we had. I'm not sure where I stand on this. I think we could see some bounce if they can continue to deliver. I think they are delivering. If they continue to do a bit more, it would be good. So that's kind of where we are. I just in Argentina, you're going to see the president of the central bank next week, right? So you'll hear from him. But I think what's happening in Brazil and in Argentina is very, very important. It is, I think, something maybe Bob will discuss. I think this is a window of opportunity for the U.S. to get close, to engage. It's been a long time. Brazil and Argentina were kind of on the fence, kind of where you had Chile, Peru, Colombia, Mexico doing well, and then you had Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, disaster, Argentina, sort of a disaster as well, and Brazil, I think, also a disaster, quite frankly. And so if the two largest of the kind of disaster camp move out, it's a phenomenal opportunity, and so I would hope at this point that the incoming U.S. government can kind of rebuild some bridges and do some things, hopefully, on trade. On trade, it would require, I think, the U.S. to, at least from the standpoint of Brazil, to talk about some things that really never went very far. Agriculture. Actually, the U.S. has done some things unilaterally there that are quite positive. Anti-dumping, stuff like that. So I think there's a chance we can do really meaningful things at this point, and I hope the next government here is up to that. They can kind of look over the wall if that turns out to be the case, and do something more constructive, but not in the literal sense. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Arminio. Yes, worrying about presidents who view red lights as personal offenses is a problem we all share, but thank you for that brilliant summary of the Brazilian situation. I'm going to turn now to Bob Zoellick for a few brief remarks, responding to Arminio, but also, as we said, putting this in the context of the future for the U.S. and the region. I should also note that Bob just published last week a super piece in Harvard Business Review, I believe online before the printed edition, on trade and the interests of corporates around the world to really line up and stand up for trade, as well as the policy interest. And I read it over the weekend. I thought it was great. And I'm proud to say I think our report last week on the presidential trade policies complements it nicely. But let me turn to Bob for today's topic.
Well, first, it's a privilege to be here with Arminio, who was both a superb public servant but also investor. And so I thank Adam for that and the Peterson Institute's focus on Latin America. And just also to highlight some of the work that's been done, I had an opportunity to read Monica DeBole's piece, I think in a briefing that you did
Yes.
At the start of the year, and it's a very good sort of comment on sort of the conditions in Brazil. I wanted to try to complement Arminio's excellent presentation by making 4 quick points on Latin America and then concluding with some observations on Brazil and U.S. policy. Maybe this can give some guidance for future topics for the Peterson Institute. First, as Arminio mentioned at the end, of course, there's different Latin Americas. The Pacific Alliance of Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile have been more open to trade and investment. They've had better performance, but they also face some risks today too, and Chile is an interesting example of that. Then there's the ALBA countries, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, generally populist, authoritarian tendencies, large indigenous populations that have been weakly integrated. In general, heavy reliance on energy or mineral production, and they also face a range of troubles. Then there's Central America, which of course is small and varied. Some are fragile states and risk being overwhelmed by criminal and drug networks, actually some risks of state takeover. Then there's Panama and the Caribbean, which are really special cases requiring special attention. Then, as Arminio mentioned, there's Mercosur, which is really especially Brazil and Argentina, but also Paraguay and Uruguay. But just keep in mind, Brazil is 40% of Latin America's GDP, so you can see the significance of that. And as you've heard, the policies courteously have been described as more interventionist, state nature. Second point, useful to recall the historical patterns of Latin America. And Arminio touched on some of this. Boom and bust economies driven heavily by commodity markets, weak macro policies, a political history of caudillos and strongman governments, which had led to weak rule of law, corruption, instability, a wide gap between rich and poor, populist temptation, and in a global comparison, very weak intra-regional trade. It increased from about 13 to 20%, but as a comparison in Asia, that number is 40%. In Europe, it's 60%. So as a result, Latin America has had smaller markets, very limited regional production change, and limited participation in global change, something I'll come back to. Nevertheless, and Arminio was part of this, the debt crisis of the 80s and late 90s led to some very important reforms. Stronger macro policies, independent central banks, flexible exchange rates, stronger institutions in financial systems, greater trade openness, what people used to refer to as the Washington Consensus until it fell afoul of the new matrix and other appealing concepts until they're no longer appealing. The greater trade openness drove microeconomic and institutional reforms in some, and the U.S. was part of this with NAFTA and the U.S. free trade agreements with Colombia, Peru, Chile, Central America, Dominican Republic, and Panama. And just to give you a reference point, those free trade agreements cover about 50% of the non-U.S. GDP in the hemisphere, actually a little bit more. But the free trade area of the Americas, something that Mac and President Clinton launched, really was a step too far, in part because of challenges of Brazil and Argentina, but other issues as well. Third, this progress in the 80s and 90s laid a foundation for what is seen in the region as the golden decade of 2003 to 2011. Now, of course, this was helped by the commodity boom and China's growth. There was an innovative use of conditional cash transfers, which drove down poverty rates. So this started in Mexico, but actually when President Lula came in and had a generalized hunger program, he worked with the World Bank based on the Mexico experience to develop the Bolsa Familia program, which was quite successful, dealing with poverty at the bottom 15 to 20% for about 0.5% of GDP. In combination, this led to a rising middle class. So if you define this at between about $10 and $53 a day, the percentage increased in Latin America from 21% to about 35%. Between 2003 and 11. There was some structural reform, often driven by trade. Region weathered the global financial crisis relatively well, but, and there were two big buts. One, it didn't rebuild fiscal cushions, and in summary of what Arminio said, politicians began to believe their own press releases, which is always risky. So fourth, today's challenges. Let me highlight three. One, the continuation of the cyclical issues, the commodity cycle, great deceleration, fiscal and external imbalances, and of course, some uncertainty about the Fed's rate of increases, and particularly for dollar borrowers. Two, longer term, keep in mind this is the most urbanized developing region, about 80% urbanization. So issues of transport, housing, sprawl, basic public services, those drive politics and life in many Latin American countries. The share of the working age population has peaked, and in some countries they will face difficult adjustments from climate change. The third challenge is one that any government has to factor in, although it's hard to predict, and that is the disruptions of life. El Nino, the Zika outbreak, natural disasters, which especially can overwhelm the small states, Caribbean, Central America, and can just wipe out 5 years of good work, suggesting the need for greater risk management and insurance policies. The needs, which Arminio touched on the microeconomic side, are really the factors of productivity, education, infrastructure, integration, health services, labor markets, capital markets, better targeting of social subsidies, and reduction of energy subsidies, which has been a costly production of carbon, but also budget waste in really every country. There's another challenge developing, which is the expectations of good performers. And here, I hope PI has a chance to look a little bit at Chile, because there's an interesting case if you look at what's happening in the pension system and education system, where after an economy that's done very well over decades, the public starts to want more, and we'll see whether the system can hold. And also, as Arminio mentioned, the after effects of the Venezuelan crisis, which is soon to come, if not already upon us. A few comments on Brazil. This may surprise you, but in sum, I am relatively bullish if the country makes it through the downturn into the 2018 elections. And let me add to what Arminio said with a bit of a political economy analysis. He was modest. If you look at the President Cardozo team, Arminio, Pedro Milan, Celso Laffer, this was an extraordinary group. And I know Mac has the same experience. This is where there's always a question among historians about, do figures in history, do individuals matter? I personally believed if Celso Laffer had stayed as foreign minister and trade minister, we would have had a Doha round and perhaps a free trade area of the Americas, and it would have been a very different picture going forward. As he mentioned, for Lula and Dilma and the PT, you need to put this in historical context. These were people that came out of the military junta era. They were Marxist. To their credit, unlike much of the rest of the Latin American left, they stayed in the democratic system. Lula fought election after election, lost time after time. They stayed in the democratic process, and you can see in Colombia and other countries where that didn't happen. But no doubt their economics were very statist, and that created this dangerous opportunity for corruption. And just to connect this again internationally, Ottaviano, who worked with me at the World Bank, is aware of this. We had the first chief economist for the developing world, Justin Lin from China. He developed a new theory of what he called the new structural economics. Some of us reminded him of the old structural economics of Latin America. And I used to say to Justin, you have to talk to Ottaviano, because maybe the strong state works for a while in China, but discuss with the Latin Americans their experience of a very powerful state and some of the dangers that it provides. And I mention this in part because while I was making a slight joke about the Washington Consensus, I think some of these ideas about overall structures of the economy should be debated. There is kind of this dismissing of the Washington Consensus, and obviously you can always improve on it. But some of the ideas that we're seeing as current in the commodity boom with China, we'll see how those survive over time. And I saw this directly in the case of Brazil. A very big positive that Arminio just touched on is the strength of the legal, judicial, prosecutorial system. This is an unbelievably impressive performance, which you do not see in many other systems. And you can see, actually, the connectivity of these people with other countries, including the United States, and what they learned about political impunity and dealing with rule of law and institutions. I would add to that. When I was at the World Bank, we worked very closely with the state governors, because some of the federal government systems were pretty well developed, but the states were still quite weak. And what I found was the next generation of leaders were generally practical, pragmatic, believed in market reforms with inclusive economics. One of the real tragedies of life was the one who I found best, a man named Eduardo Campos, who was the governor of Pernambuco, died in an airplane crash in the last election. So I look to 2018 and beyond as a real possibility for Brazil. Now, in the near term, it's going to be very painful with political stress. The external imbalances have moderated, but as he mentioned, the fiscal balance is quite high and potentially dangerous. And frankly, as someone who also watched markets, I'm not sure that the spreads have factored all this in. Foreign investment has come down a little bit, but if you look at the numbers, they remain quite high, and the country is vulnerable to a sell-off of this debt. With the big deficits, of course, they have to be financed. And if you look at what's happened in Brazil, they've been financed by reallocations of public pensions, and they're almost totally already in government bonds. The banks have also shifted a lot to financing the government, but they're hit by bad debts, and they've got some capital problems, so they've got limited ability to finance. The government short-term debt is generally short-term. It needs about 50% of GDP for debt to cover the rollover and the deficit numbers. So in an environment where unemployment is high, you have excess capacity, collapse in corporate profits, and inflation is persistent because of the devaluation, this is a very tricky period. And that's why I'll come back to the point that Arminio closed with, which is much of Brazil's spending is mandated by the Constitution. This is different than other systems. And so primary government expenditures rose from 22% of GDP in 91 to 36% in 2014. And so these two steps that President Temer has talked about, which the first one is for 20 years, nominal annual increases in public expenditures, including at the subnational level, are not supposed to exceed the inflation rate of the prior year, and the pension issue. If he can deliver on those, then I think that Brazil is in a position to really be quite a surprise performer after 2018. Now, the last point on this is bring it back to the political economy and the shift in in the next generation. Look, no self-respecting Brazilian can say we're going to follow the Pacific Alliance countries, these small little countries like Chile and Peru and Colombia, or Mexico. God knows Brazil can't follow Mexico. But if you actually talk to many next-generation Brazilians or people thinking about the future, they've kept a very close eye on what happened in the Pacific Alliance countries. And Foreign Minister Serra, who's often been quite outspoken on a number of topics, is already saying this. So frankly, it's quite important that the Pacific Alliance countries don't blow it. So message to Chile, whose president thought that she should follow the Brazilian model for some reason. So let me conclude with U.S. policy. And maybe Mac McLarty, I hope, will have a chance to implement this. I think there's a totally overlooked opportunity for the United States to work with Brazil and perhaps Argentina through the Pacific Alliance countries if U.S. trade policy isn't paralyzed, and that's a very big if. The fiscal decisions that we've discussed today have to be Brazil's, but there are interesting structure and institutional issues where the U.S. could be of help. And I mentioned to Ottaviano as I came in that he wrote a piece recently that highlighted one of these, which is human capital. It turns out that private companies invest less in HR training in Brazil than those companies in other countries with similar per capita incomes. And Ottaviano pointed to the tax incentives that and disincentives that lead to this. Arminio mentioned infrastructure, and I continue to believe in many parts of the world the multilaterals could work with the private sector to try to create the right incentive structures and best practical design. And then I mentioned the issues of disease and insurance. So what I've observed over the course of 20 or 30 years is structural reforms can be very actively linked to trade policies. This is certainly the lesson of Mexico and NAFTA. And I think if the next Brazilian government is elected on a reform message, and this would be a reform of corruption and institutions, building on what the Temer government does, you have an entrepreneurial country with extraordinary talent. Frankly, I think private equity investors could find a lot of interesting opportunities there, and the institutions and political reforms are at a key juncture. So here is the strategic aim that the U.S. should have. For well over a century, much of Latin America has looked at the U.S. in a north-south relationship. If you look at U.S. policy with Mexico, it was not only to connect it to North America, but was to give a east-west and global perspective. So shortly after NAFTA, the U.S. government worked to try to draw Mexico into APEC, into the OECD process. It's part of the TPP process. And I think this is absolutely critical, and it's part of the whole logic of the Pacific Alliance countries, which is the benchmark and comparisons should not just be with the gringos to the north. They should be with what's happening in Asia, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Africa and the rest of the world. During my time in government and at the World Bank, much of the attitude, you could see a debate in Brazil, but many of the leaders still had a G77 north-south outlook. And frankly, that hurt on trade policy. I think that's behind the times, but I think this is now an interesting moment, because when you have a big break like this, what controls is a shift in ideas and thinking of men and women. And I think that's the moment that offers the greatest opportunity. So I hope that the United States works closely not only with Brazil, but with the other countries in the region, because I think it could have a global effect at a time that people like Larry Summers are talking about secular stagnation. I see a lot of potential demand in the developing world if we create some of the fundamentals right, but that will be a question for 2017.
Thank you very much, Bob. As always, you just knit things together along with the real world in a way that's so valuable. Arminio, is there anything you'd like to say in response to Bob, to add at this point, or should we move to questions?
I think we should move to questions.
Very good.
There's a lot going on down there, but I'd rather address issues that people may have in their minds.
Great. Thank you for offering to do that. So, as usual, this is on the record. We have a traveling mic in front in Jessica's hand. We have a standing mic in back. Please either stand at the mic or wave your hand to be recognized. Please identify yourself when you speak. If the gentleman back could go to the mic, please. And then the more you make it a question instead of an opinion statement, the more time you get. If you could give to the lady in front, and then we'll go to the standing mic. Jessica.
Very quickly, this is Lorenzo.
No, with the lady in front first. No, it's not.
Okay.
Teresa goes first.
Okay. Teresa Terminasian, formerly from the IMF. Very interesting presentations, both. Congratulations. My question is basically to Arminio, and it is to do. I have two questions. I would have many more, but I mean, let's limit it to two. One is, how do you see the role of monetary policy and also of credit policy in promoting now a revival of activity in Brazil? The second is, are you at all concerned with the potential for the judiciary to be somewhat muzzled by the forces in Congress that are, against this important role? I mean, you have seen the pronouncements of some important politicians saying that this has gone too far.
Okay, so monetary policy is facing, I think, a real challenge. Inflation this year will probably end up being around 7%, give or take, probably a little higher. And they have committed to hitting the target of 4.5% for next year. So it's a major effort. I don't believe they're going to count on much support from the fiscal authorities in the near term. And I think credit will I guess they're going to be neutral. So this is an improvement from the standpoint of the central bank from what you had in the recent years past, where, except for the year Joaquim Levy was in government, I should say. But before him, with the previous group, macro policy was completely schizophrenic. So you had the central bank trying to keep inflation reasonably under control, and the other side kind of pumping hard. So it was difficult. My guess is that they'll make an effort to get inflation down up until, and this is what I read from their statements, not my imagination. But there's a point where, the lagged effects of monetary policy move us into 2018. And once you reach that, then I think the forecasts are actually quite good. And so they may be able to cut. The recession is very deep, so the sort of Phillips curve component is kicking in strongly, but there's a lot of inertia, so this battle. So I think they're in a bit of a tight spot for a little while. I think they're already beginning to look through next year gently, because they don't want to kind of lose their credibility. So it's a bit of a balancing act. On the judiciary, I think the main issue is the financing of campaigns, in particular what they call down there the Caixa 2, so the unofficial monies. And my understanding is the use of that kind of money was widespread, and it ranges from providing a room for a political meeting to paying for a poll and sharing it with the candidate, or even taking instructions from a candidate, to more, just piles of cash or deposits in some banking centers that are not so careful, etc. So there's the whole range. And no one knows for sure how far they're going to go, and I think there's a general feeling amongst citizens of Brazil, myself included, that they should do their job. And so it means we're going into a crucial political moment where we expect Congress to deliver on some of these reforms, including political reform that I forgot to mention, but they are two very basic proposals on the table that I think are very important. One, limiting the number of parties. So I think that's a major issue. But I think for the most part, the judiciary will work, and they'll work according to the law. And Congress is in this delicate position of considering some changes with the people of Brazil in sort of a lynching mode. So, I don't know, I think you put your finger on two very, as you always do, very important and difficult topics. I'm more optimistic on what the central bank's going to do. I think we have a superb team in place, and I think they're going to be reasonable and kind of find the right path down. And it'll be down, and inflation is going to be down enough, and expectations are likely to be okay, assuming the politics don't misbehave too badly.
Thank you. Lorenzo, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Adam. First question, Lorenzo Giorgiani from Tudor Investment Corporation. First, for Arminio, we all look at 2018 elections as a positive turning point. How do we, as investors, how do we appraise the risk of actually a negative turning point where you have a populist candidate, maybe not a Lula type, but someone that is not going to embrace the type of reforms that we all look forward to? And the second question for both, if you want to weigh in on trade side, are there any quick wins, low-hanging fruits from trade opening in Latin America that could help growth in the not too far distant period ahead? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before our colleagues reply, our guests rather, I should say reply, I just want to mention that our colleague Chad Bown had a very nice recent short piece on Mercosur being trade opening in reverse that we have up on the website that I would suggest you look at, which fits with some of the things Bob was mentioning earlier. But anyway, please, the first one was political risk.
Yeah,
the second one was
sure.
Easy wins on trade.
Thinking ahead. So 2018 is close, but for us down there, it feels like ages away. Kind of hard to predict. I think there's still room for a different kind of populist to win the day. Basically saying the problem with these people was the corruption, but and make all kinds of promises. And based on that. So it's hard to tell. For now, it looks difficult for the PT and for former President Lula to make a comeback. He is a political giant. He's done some things that are terribly disappointing and sadly so. So I think the odds of either Lula himself or someone coming from the populist side winning are non-negligible. I think it's still in the tail risk department, a very fat tail though, very fat. So on trade, Mercosur is complicated with the presence of Venezuela. Mercosur has always been very tough. When I was in government, I was kind of engaged, but I must say, over time, at one time we were doing well, another time Argentina was doing well, and it was easy then because we didn't have Venezuela, to deal with. So I don't know about that one. I think for us, Brazil is probably doing positioning to move ahead with the deal with Europe. That one's on the table, and to open up some kind of avenue of discussion with the U.S. That's what I think. I think internally I think a lot of things we could do unilaterally, and I belong to a minority camp on that one. That would be very helpful. And I didn't mention a bunch of other things, but I also think in terms of integration, Brazil needs to integrate inside as well. Because of our tax code and our infrastructure, trading inside Brazil is impossible. It's probably easier for someone in Canada to trade with France than it is for a business in the state of São Paulo to trade with Rio. So if we could do tax reform, we could also, to take care of that and start beefing up our infrastructure, I think there could be tremendous gains from internal trade as well, not just external.
Just to add to that, the first point, which as Arminio stressed, is, countries can act on trade policy unilaterally. So if they remove some of their own barriers, they don't need agreements, but agreements often help create a political context. Second, in the modern economy, there's a lot of behind border barriers, licensing, regulation, and I would think that these barriers could be connected with the anti-corruption effort, because a lot of those steps are the types of things that officials use to get a little money on the side. And so I would start by focusing on those, including to take full advantage, as Arminio said, of the continental market. Third, however, and I think Sarah's already trying to do this, I would start to try to work with the Pacific Alliance countries just to sort of get the politics to say, look, these what these countries have done, as opposed to being antagonistic, what can we learn, what can we work together, so on and so forth. And the last piece would be, this really does depend on U.S. politics, would be, look, if you get through the 2018 period and you have a new type of government, I think this is one of these great opportunities where the United States, working with all the free trade area partners in the region, could approach Brazil and try to say, what could we do of a free trade area? And we'll see whether Argentina is there. This could be one of these historic moves. And I'll close with this point. I'm writing something actually for the FT now about kind of what to think about new administrations and their policy. And in trade, obviously, who knows with Donald Trump, and probably doesn't look good. But if Hillary Clinton's elected, one of the sort of under-recognized posts to watch would be U.S. Trade Representative, because she could go one of two ways. She obviously is in a political hole on this, given her statements and the politics of her party. She could have somebody, like we've seen in the past, who basically is a placeholder, or she could find people, and they're there in the Democratic Party, that are kind of activist, creative, trying to figure out a way to reposture trade policy. And there are things possibly with the TPP, but I might also actually start, this is something Jeff Schott and I have a slight disagreement about, with Great Britain, because Congress is very interested in doing something with free trade with Great Britain, but you move the dial, and who knows, maybe something with Latin America, with a broader Hispanic community. So watch that appointment if Hillary's elected. That will be very important for the future of these topics.
Thank you. I agree on the Pacific Alliance. I just forgot that. For us in Brazil, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, it's almost like they're in Asia, because between us and them, you have a lot of jungle in the Andes. But they're doing well. There's no reason why we shouldn't be close to them. I agree completely.
Great. I'm afraid that ends our time for today. Thank you so much to Bob for coming in and giving your unique perspective and a bit of a preview of what you'll be telling the FT in the world. But thanks especially to Arminio Fraga, who gave us his usual frank, analytic, and comprehensive view. As Bob said, your public service previously was of enormous importance, and I hope you continue to contribute to the public debate as you did here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.